Hey everybody, and welcome to today's virtual debate, Driving the Green Deal, where we'll be asking the question, how can biofuels help decarbonize EU transport? My name is Dave Keating. I'm a journalist based in Brussels, and I'm broadcasting to you live from the Euractiv studio in the EU quarter, right next to the European Commission, where all of the policy we're going to be talking about today is being crafted. I'm going to be guiding us through today's discussions. Now, you just saw some of the instructions there in the video that ran before I started speaking, but to reiterate, again, this is a virtual debate. You guys are out there in your homes or in your offices, as are our panelists, but you are going to have the opportunity to ask questions to our panelists, and that's going to be done through the Q&A feature. So you'll see on your screen you have a chat option. Feel free to make whatever comments you'd like to make there, and you also have the option to ask questions. It's important that if you have a question that you want me to read out to the panel, don't put it in the chat box, put it in the Q&A feature. I'm going to go ahead and start the Q&A now. And you can feel free to ask questions as we go along. When it gets time to the Q&A, I'll be looking and kind of ordering questions in a logical way, and looking forward to getting your very probing questions. So we're here today to talk about the European Green Deal and how biofuels fits into that. Now, I'm sure most of you know this, but for those of you who don't, I'll go through a little bit about what the European Green Deal is. It was put forward in December. It's basically a big umbrella framework for the EU's decarbonization strategy. And at its core is a target for 2050 for the EU to completely decarbonize and get down to net zero emissions. Now, within that, of course, since it's an umbrella policy, you have lots of sectoral targets, and one big focus is transport. Transport, according to the European Commission, accounts for a quarter of EU greenhouse gas emissions. And so a 90% decrease in transport emissions is going to be needed to meet that 2050 goal. It's a pretty big ask. So how do we do this? Well, there's lots of different ways. Of course, electrification has been a big focus, but also renewable fuels, which can sometimes, not always, but sometimes be used in traditional cars. And so renewable fuels have been a big area of focus, and as I'm sure a lot of you out there are aware, it's been a big legislative and regulatory focus in the European Union over the last 10 years. We've had a kind of back and forth on biofuels after concerns were raised about first-generation biofuels and the indirect land use change that they were resulting in. And now we have a kind of new framework that EU lawmakers are hoping are solving some of those initial sustainability concerns. And so now we can really go forward with renewable fuels. So with this new framework in place, and particularly with the revised Renewable Energy Directive in 2018, we're now kind of in an implementation phase. Of course, everybody's hoping that now the regulation is going to be a little more stable going forward, a little more predictable, and that businesses can really see where to invest, particularly knowing the EU's very ambitious targets. And of course, it's not just that 2050 target. We also have interim targets for 2020 and 2030. We already know that half of EU member states are not going to meet their 2020 target. And so we're really looking to whether or not they can meet the 2030 target, which the European Commission wants to increase the overall emissions reduction from the agreed 40% to 55%. We'll see if national governments do sign off on that. So let me introduce our very distinguished panel to be talking about some of these issues. We have Alexander Pacaud. He is head of the Road Transport Unit at the European Commission's Transport Department. Then we have John Cooper, Director of the Industry Association Fuels Europe. We have Paul Greening, Emissions and Fuel Director at the European Automobile Manufacturers Association, ASEA. And finally, we have Dasha Mamrelova, EU Affairs Manager at biofuels producer envision. Thank you all for joining us today. So I want to start off with some questions for each of you to get your kind of general thoughts on the topic. Alex, I'll start with you. And let me ask you, I think, kind of the fundamental question we're grappling with here. Is the European Green Deal aiming to increase the use of biofuels? And if it is, how does the Green Deal envision increasing the use of biofuels?
Hello, Dave, and hello, everybody. Thanks for inviting me to join this panel. Yeah, first of all, let's come back to what you just said about the overall objective of the European Green Deal, which is to reach climate neutrality by 2050. And that means actually in the shorter term, increasing the ambition level to at least 55% in 2030. This is what the Commission proposed last week as part of the climate target plan, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard about. And raising this ambition in terms of greenhouse gas emission targets requires stepping up efforts in all the sectors of the economy. And you mentioned, Dave, the transport sector, which indeed is a very challenging sector to address because this is the only sector where we have seen increase of emissions during the past years. So climate neutrality by 2050 means for the transport sector a reduction of 90%. So a big effort to be made. And when we look at what are the key actions, the key initiatives which the Commission will take in the next couple of months, this relates to a number of aspects, because to reach this overall objective, a very holistic approach is required. And that will mean revisiting the CO2 standards for cars and vans. This will mean accompanying this transition to zero emission mobility with rollout of infrastructure, and the Alternative Fuel Infrastructure Directive will also be up for review in the next couple of months. And it's also means looking at the fuels and how to further decarbonize fuel with the revision of the fuel-related legislation. And finally, as you have probably seen, the Commission will look at the possible extension of the ETS to all fossil fuels. So a number of policy initiatives aiming to reduce emission in the transport sector. And all of that will be looked at in the next couple of months. June 2021, this is the moment where the Commission will come with its legislative package with all the different instruments to reach this increase of ambition to 55%. Coming back to your question, biofuels. Yes, biofuels is part of the fuel mix today and will remain an important part of that in the next years. When we look at our analytical work underpinning the climate target plan, we see that biofuels, but also more broadly, advanced biofuels or renewable low carbon fuels will have a role to play, and in particular in the sectors which are the most difficult to decarbonize. So that would be my introductory remarks. Thank you, Dave.
Thanks a lot, Alex. John, let's go to you next. You're dealing with the whole liquid fuels mix. So what do you think the role of biofuels will be within that larger mix of liquid fuels?
So first of all, again, thanks for the opportunity to be part of this. It's a very useful debate. We've done work to look at what is the role for liquid fuels in the future. And one of the conclusions we came to quickly is that the sheer quantities of petroleum that are used today are going to be difficult to replace with any one single technology, especially when you look across all of the different modes. So the basis of the work that we've done is to look at every available technology to reduce the carbon intensity of the liquid fuel down to climate neutrality in 2050. And that includes the use of today's levels of sustainable first generation biofuels, and then significant growth in advanced biofuels, complemented by some e-fuels or synthetic fuels to come later. And then also using in the production processes, while we are ramping down the use of the petroleum component, to use carbon capture and storage and clean hydrogen in the manufacture, so that the carbon intensity is driven down by all of those pieces. Now, in that overall picture, biofuels plays a significant role. In the early decades, the the early years, the major growth would be in advanced biofuels. We would expect synthetic fuels to come later when the quantities of electricity are there. And so developing the integration between first generation and second generation biofuels, for example, and also the use of biomass for advanced biofuels and then potentially also chemicals, is something that will be a major feature of the strategy that we describe. And I guess I should also just say two things. One is the strategy we describe is designed to be complementary to electrification. Electrification of light transport, we do expect to be a very substantial part of the scene. But we also see that using the developments in biofuels in road transport will help us to develop the technologies more quickly. While we see there's a consensus that aviation and maritime will be a natural destination for biofuels and renewable fuels for the longer term, the challenge we have is in terms of policy instruments, they're not strong enough to make a substantial investment program in the early years. And so there's some very good reasons for the sake of broader transport to also include some biofuels growth in road transport in the early years. Thanks.
Well, John, you mentioned electrification. Paul, let's go to you next. We've seen, especially in the last months, that automakers have really been embracing electric models, basically since I'd say like halfway through last year. So given all the focus on electrification, what is the auto industry's view on biofuels right now, particularly as a potential tool to help reach average fleet CO2 targets?
Hi, David, and everybody. Good afternoon to you. Nice to join the panel this afternoon. You say that automakers have embraced electric models. Yes, of course we are, and all manufacturers are starting to roll out a range of battery electric vehicles, plug-in hybrid vehicles, non-chargeable hybrid technologies. But what we really need is also now for the customers to embrace those sorts of technologies at greater levels than they are at the moment. It is true that in the last quarter, the second quarter of 2020, the market share of battery electric and plug-in hybrids has gone up compared to last year, a 7.2% increase. Still small numbers in terms of normal registrations of vehicles in the year, not forgetting, of course, that this year has been quite severely disrupted in terms of overall volumes. And we've seen quite a drastic drop in the numbers of petrol and diesel vehicles being chosen by customers. Perhaps it's got something to do also with quite a few member states have introduced a number of different types of incentives, which are giving some benefits and encouragement to push customers towards electrically chargeable vehicles. But not all of those incentives are long running. Some of them will be phasing out this year, some might continue into next year. So there still needs to be some push, but more importantly, if that's really going to take off as a technology of choice, there really has got to be a bigger effort in increasing the infrastructure, not just on electric recharging, but all of the different types of new approaches on powertrain and fuels which are being talked about. For example, hydrogen or natural gas, liquefied natural gas still plays a role. Now, when it comes to biofuels, we're highly interested in that because the internal combustion engine is not going to go away. And what's highly interesting about moving to low carbon fuels is the potential for those fuels to be drop-ins such that the whole fleet can use those fuels. So we're not talking about trying to make CO2 reductions just dependent on the introduction of new vehicles into the fleet, which takes time and in recent years has been overcome by the increase in transport use. But by also concentrating in a more holistic manner on options which the existing fleet can also use, then there is a capability there for making a bigger dent in total road transport emissions by providing solutions to everybody, old vehicles and new vehicles. And it was interesting also to see publication just the other day by the ICCT, which is focused on that aspect. Yes, there will be continued improvement in the efficiency of internal combustion engines and introduction of new powertrain options. But they do agree that the internal combustion isn't going to go away. CO2 is not a local issue, it's a global issue. Other markets have different priorities. We as global automakers have to address those global markets. We can't invest solely in electric just for Europe. We have to invest heavily to deliver cleaner and better products into other markets. So it does make sense to see that biofuels, drop-in biofuels, more advanced sustainable green molecules, as well as green electrons, are here to stay and should be actively pursued.
Dasha, let's turn to you next. As I mentioned in the introductory remarks, we have this distinction now between first generation and second generation biofuels. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what that means and how are the latest generation of biofuels different from previous generations?
Thank you, Dave. Good afternoon to everybody. First of all, let me say that I am very glad to be in the panel together with European Commission, fuel suppliers and car manufacturers, which shows the common interest of all the stakeholders on sustainable liquid fuels, and which confirms the importance of sustainable liquid fuels. I'm here representing the European Renewable Ethanol Association, EPUR, but let me say also a few words about the company I work for. NVN Group is the biggest Central and Eastern European biofuels holding with its headquarters in Slovakia. We have production facilities, except of Slovakia, also in Czech Republic, Hungary and Croatia. And we produce both conventional bioethanol and biodiesel, but have also several projects for production of advanced biofuels, like the investment into 50,000 tons of lignocellulosic ethanol in our production premises in Slovakia, or the investment into production of advanced and waste-based biodiesel in Hungary. Back to your question, Dave, I would like to point out that both conventional and advanced biofuels are extremely essential for contribution to the Green Deal goals. They both are sustainable. They differ from the feedstock from which they are produced, like conventional biofuels are produced from so-called food and feed crops, which means like maize, wheat, or rapeseed, and advanced biofuels are produced from waste and residues. But all the biofuels placed on the market now have to fulfill very strict sustainability criteria according to current legislation. They have to be, or the crops for their production are allowed to be grown only on a certain dedicated land, and they have to achieve minimum greenhouse gas emission savings. For example, the renewable ethanol produced now in European Union achieves 72.5% emission savings compared to fossil fuels. For biodiesel, it is slightly less, but it is still very significant stake. Conventional biofuels represent currently approximately 60% of all renewable energy sources in the transport sector, and together with advanced biofuels, the share of biofuels in transport or in renewable energy sources in transport is 89%. In some countries, like my country, Slovakia, it's even more than 90%. So it shows the extremely importance of them, as they are the solution which is widely available now, as almost one solution which we have already on the table. It was said several times by my colleagues in the panel that the transport sector is extremely difficult to be decarbonized. It is the only one sector where emissions are rising and are currently 19% higher than they were in the year 1990. All over, they are responsible for more than a quarter of total emissions, and solely road transport is responsible for 21% of total emissions. So it's crucial to achieve this 90% emission savings to reach the climate neutrality. The Green Deal raises the ambition even higher than it is now, where the member states are struggling to meet their targets for 2020, both in terms of renewable energy targets and in terms of emission savings. And the targets are about to be increased. The European Commission announced recently that the share of renewable energy in transport sector should be like 24%, which is 10% higher than the target in place now. And the reality nowadays is 6% renewable energy in transport. So we really have to do more. And biofuels are here now. The latest legislation, Renewable Energy Directive 2, has confirmed the contribution of both conventional and advanced biofuels until 2030. But I would like to point out that biofuels can do even more to achieve these very ambitious targets. Already in certain countries in European Union, the ethanol blend was increased to double from E5 to E10. The same can be done with biodiesel from B7 to B10, and we can go further to higher ethanol blends and biodiesel blends. So it's now up to the legislators how the legislation will be shaped. And the most important thing which I would like to say that to come the new technologies to the market and to invest into that, the most important issue is to have very stable legislative framework to give the investors the certainty and security to invest.
Thanks, Dasha. So I want to start out with a question to all of you about technology neutrality. As I mentioned in the beginning, there are a lot of different tools available to lower transport emissions, and of course biofuels are just one of them. You know, the Commission says that it's technology neutral in terms of how emissions should be lowered, but I think there are some questions being asked about whether current policies are truly technology neutral. John, let me get your thoughts on this. I mean, would you say that the current EU policies in place are technology neutral when it comes to lowering transport emissions?
Well, transport emissions is a term that is quite inclusive and is obviously the range of emissions that are caused by any one decision to take transport or to put a vehicle on the road. The core regulation that is driving much of the change in European transport, in road transport, is the CO2 vehicle regulation, and I think it's fair to say that regulation, you can't really describe it as technology neutral because it is essentially a regulation on tailpipe emissions. If the emissions are from the vehicle are elsewhere in the production of the energy or the vehicle, they are not regulated by that. And at the low levels of GHG that we're talking about now to meet the Green Deal, then the only thing that, well, there's only two technologies that are recognized as being potentially able to give climate neutrality in that regulation, and it's electricity and hydrogen. And in fact, there isn't a regulation on the source of the electricity or the hydrogen, as far as I understand. And the liquid fuel wouldn't be recognized under that regulation. And so that regulation, as you go to lower numbers, is primarily forcing electrification. And so I think it's fair to say that that regulation doesn't really meet that standard of technology neutrality. We've actually proposed ways to correct that with some kind of correction factor. And we think that could work either at a general fleet level, shall we say, where the entire fuel pool is reduced in carbon intensity, or there could be ways of dedicating volumes of renewable fuel, potentially even climate neutral fuel, to new vehicles, so that a new vehicle running exclusively on that fuel could and arguably should be rated in a similar way to an electric or hydrogen vehicle. It's a concept that we're asking people to consider because we think it will be a useful facility for customers, fleets, etc. And that would actually give technology neutrality in the choice to the customers.
Well, Alex, let me put that to you. I mean, is there a risk that you could get a renewable fueled car scoring better on the car CO2 limits because the emissions from making the battery, making the car, generating the power aren't reflected in those tailpipe emissions?
Yeah, so I think what John is explaining is actually that we need a very holistic approach to reduce transport emissions, and some are calling for kind of one legislation which would address basically both the tailpipe emissions and the way fuels are being produced and used. The co-legislator so far has taken another view, which is to have an holistic approach, but to regulate the fuels and the emissions, the tailpipe emissions of vehicles in two separate legislation. And this is the combination of the two legislation which will bring the emissions down for the road transport sector. And this will, of course, require some further analysis, and we are very happy that Fuels Europe is coming with some suggestions, and we will be continuing to look into that, and we will review this possibility in view of our future proposal in June 2021. But so far we have in the legislation a clear distinction in order to ensure clear responsibilities between the producers of the fuel and the producers of the vehicles. What we have seen so far in terms of suggestions would kind of mix the two, and we are not completely sure that this would bring clarity and certainty also for the producers of vehicle. But as I said, we will be looking at that again in the upcoming review.
Paul, how do the automakers feel about this issue of tailpipe emissions measurements?
Well, a quick word on the technical neutrality. I would share John's views that while the legislation may be framed that way, the targets that are being talked about now, 25, 30 and beyond, are pretty much one-dimensional in terms of technology. And it's clear in some of the communications that we've read recently that there are clear mentionings of electricity for cars. Liquid and gaseous fuels have potential for other road vehicles where it might be more difficult, but at least in the transitional period. But not to say that all vehicles of all types of utility are seriously looking at alternative modes of powertrain, electricity included, hydrogen included, and any other options that come into the equation. The co-regulators have concentrated on the regulations in two separate ways: the fuel side, the vehicle side. It would be nice to have a discussion about that, but I share Alex's views that seems to be the way it's going to remain, and there will be continued pressure on the vehicle side to push down the tailpipe emissions, CO2 emissions we're talking about here, from new vehicles in the ways which are currently regulated, and also in ways which encourage technology change. And we're already seeing that happen now, and we have deep concerns that will continue, and we do expect to be faced with a very challenging situation when we have the review of 2021. The other things that come out of the tailpipe, of course, are also other pollutant emissions. We think on that side that the technologies that we have today, Euro 6 vehicles, cars, trucks and vans, are massively cleaner than what they are and demonstrate very, very good emissions performance on the road where it counts, not in the lab. Let's move on from the situation that we had a couple of years ago and look to the future, which is certainly brighter when it comes to pollutant emissions. But there is a discussion now on whether we should have Euro 7 standards. So when you start front-loading the regulatory burden on manufacturers in certain ways, it's reasonable to start thinking, when will the vehicle manufacturers start to decide which way do they want to go? Because the wallet is not as deep as some people think. We're seeing massive amounts of money being suggested in the MFF recovery program. and a lot of that will be needed if Europe is going to put money where its mouth is in pushing the technology to go in certain ways. So technology neutrality we're not sure about. And let's not forget, as I mentioned before, that the European industry is a global industry. We're not going to turn totally towards electrification as our powertrain of choice. Manufacturers have got to stay in business and deliver products to other world areas. And it would be unforgivable if Europe was to heavily burden the European industry in ways which it simply could not afford to go.
I mean, one of the reasons why both policymakers and even manufacturers may be highlighting electrification in their communications is because biofuels have had kind of a rough ride over the past 10 years because of the revelations about indirect land use change and the very heavy campaigning by climate activists to change some of those EU rules. So Dasha, let me ask you, after the EU biofuels law reform, I mean, how much does the risk of indirect land use change remain? Is it still there partially? Can consumers and potential drivers who might want to use a biofuel, can they be reassured that the framework is in place now to make sure that some of the things that we were seeing happening before aren't happening anymore?
Yes, the indirect land use change risk was already tackled recently in the Delegated Act to the Renewable Energy Directive 2. And after heavy analysis and assessment of all the feedstocks for production of biofuels, just palm oil was assigned as the biofuel or the feedstock for biofuel production with high indirect land usage change risk. And palm oil should be then phased out from the European biofuels mix. So we are confident with the fact that all the biofuels which remain now in the current transport energy mix are rid of this high indirect land usage change risk, and this has been solved for now. If possible, I would like to say a few words to your last question about technology neutrality and the approach of European Commission to technology neutrality. We would really like to see a level playing field for all the market players and for everybody. Like, just to give you an example, for biofuels, we have to count the emissions from the whole life cycle, from the very beginning when the farmers get to the field to grow the crops for production of biofuels to the end. And we have to count even with the electricity emissions for the electricity which is used for production of biofuels. So this makes some contribution to our total emissions. But when we go to electromobility, then the emissions, the tailpipe emissions from electromobility are considered as zero. So here we really see an injustice, and we really hope that lawmakers will look at that, and also what John mentioned, will try to find a real picture about emissions, also in the CO2 standards for cars and on the whole market, because what really matters is the end effect on reaching the climate neutrality.
Paul, you had a response to that?
Alex.
Not. I think maybe Alex is the right person to answer about that.
Yeah, maybe I hear somebody asking to talk. I thought it was Paul. Alex, go ahead.
Yeah, just to maybe respond to what Dasha just said about electricity production and the fact that this is not counted in the tailpipe legislation that we have for the CO2 standards for cars. One has again to look at the holistic approach and the fact that we are not going to address the transport challenge with only one piece of legislation. And here, typically with electricity production, we have a particular instrument, which is the EU ETS. And this EU ETS will lead to a very strong, deep decarbonization of the electricity sector in the years to come. So we have a tool, a policy tool, which will drive emissions down from the electricity production. So when we look at the longer term, when we look at our objective of climate neutrality by 2050, we know that this will only happen if we have a decarbonized electricity production. And this is to be seen again in the overall picture of how we can decarbonize the transport sector.
Let me go to Paul next. I have a question for you about the effect of COVID-19. There have been effects on auto manufacturers that we've seen so far. So obviously we had one framework, one plan in place in all areas of life before the pandemic hit, and COVID-19 has changed a lot of our plans. So when it comes to the auto industry's thinking about biofuels and meeting its CO2 limit targets, how has COVID-19 impacted those goals and those plans?
Well, clearly the pandemic has curtailed production. Factories are restarting, but operations are nowhere near the usual capacity. Production nearly 20% of last year's production as a whole, and it's am I back?
Yes, you're back, Paul. I can hear you again.
Sorry for that. Yeah, so around about 20% production loss so far compared to last year. And in August, I think the normal production is down about 32%. Now, that's just production, but then we've also got the question about registrations and sales, which are diminishing in real terms, despite the fact that customers are starting to choose alternative powertrains as well. So it's still a concern about meeting the current targets, although you read the newspapers and you start seeing manufacturers taking unique innovative solutions with pooling and other methodologies still to ensure that they're on track for meeting existing targets. Targets of 2025 and 2030, well, still to come, but we see really what is going to be the outcome of the review for cars and vans next year and the year after for heavy duty vehicles. So we've got no idea how long this pandemic is going to continue. We've got no idea how that's going to impact on the ability of manufacturers to seek investment and obtain investment and make production plans and changes. We've got pressure on other regulatory measures as well. We've got the discussion on the multi-annual financial framework. We've been pushing very hard for the EU and the member states to introduce scrapping plans to help improve emissions by renewing the fleet through increased fleet renewal stimulated by scrappage plans. Some member states are doing that, but a lot of that will depend on the financial framework which is established by the EU. But that's not going to be tomorrow. That's still going to take a year or two before anything will be realised in that dimension. So we're still really in a bit of a state of flux. We keep going, but it's still really an open question in what position we're going to be in next year, because at the moment there's no signs, unfortunately, that this current pandemic is easing.
Yeah, as we just saw with that European Commission press conference earlier today, it could actually be going in the opposite direction of easing. Alex, let me put this question to you also, because countries have already struggled to meet their renewable targets for 2020, and now you guys are talking about increasing the target for 2030. Is that really realistic when the existing targets have apparently been difficult to reach and we're dealing with an economic crisis?
Yeah, maybe before that, can I react on the COVID issue and to what Paul was saying? Because yes, we see, of course, the impact that the COVID crisis has had on industry and on on the sales. At the same time, we also see that with the recovery package that the Commission has put together, and with the action that member states are taking concretely in their recovery programs, we see a real opportunity to speed up the transition towards zero emission mobility. So when we see a number of countries which have put in place ambitious schemes to support the purchasing of zero and low emission vehicles, putting also a high amount on the table for increasing the rollout of infrastructure, supporting the value chain development of battery or hydrogen across Europe. I mean, these are very tangible, concrete investments, both from the demand and the supply side, which go in the direction of supporting this transition. So the COVID crisis is a real issue, we know that, but this also offers opportunities that this transition towards climate neutrality can happen in the best possible way. So yeah, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. So as regard your question on the revision of the Renewables Energy Directive, there you have seen the climate target plan of the Commission of last week, which says that to step up the efforts and to step up the ambition to decrease emissions by at least 55%, one has to look at the whole set of legislation. The ETS, renewables, energy efficiency are really core legislation that needs to be looked at, and that would be part of the next round of assessments. And one will have to see what comes out of this assessment in detail. But what is clear is that efforts will have to be made on a number of fronts. And when we hear also today around the table a number of stakeholders calling for support for renewable and low carbon fuel, this will also contribute to increasing the share of renewables in Europe.
John, I think I heard you asking for the floor.
Yeah, if I can come in. I mean, first of all, what Alex is saying, I think there's a lot of sense in the fact, in recognizing that you need a framework of multiple policies to deliver the broad decarbonisation across electricity, across supply chains, across fuels. That's absolutely true. And that's something that we support, and our own proposals, and in fact our own requests for regulation, are of increasing ambition levels with a longer trajectory across fuels and taxation, and potentially links to vehicles regulations as well. We see that is the structure that will give you the security of long-term demand with clear standards that can be investable to get you there. One of the points that I would make is that currently we have a system that's designed to more or less deliver a technology monopoly because of the very different carbon prices between the electricity production, which is rated at ETS, with paying a carbon price of around 30 euros at the moment, versus the carbon price applied to the tailpipe of the vehicle, which is around 500 euros a ton. And so unless we get some change there, the current regulatory structure is bound to deliver substantial or entire electrification of the light-duty fleet. Now, I understand for some that is seen as a political choice, the right political choice. I would still challenge whether it's a wise choice, and that there could, and I'm suggesting that there could be, I think, substantial benefits of having the option of also going to a renewable liquid fuel for long term for part of the transport fleet. And the reason I say this is the following. Transport is able to deliver carbon prices of 500 or more euros a ton, which actually covers the cost of a wide range of technologies that Europe will need in the long term. Currently, we're on track to spend that money entirely on electrification and not giving any support to the development of advanced biofuels, synthetic fuels, CCS at scale, green hydrogen at scale. The strategy we've described is designed to actually pull all of those technologies up to be a much bigger scale in Europe, thereby bringing the costs down, thereby enabling a lot more along the way. And so I'm just sounding this note of caution that going down a road where you keep that vehicle standard closed to any other form of decarbonisation is using that one opportunity with the high carbon prices for only one technology. And incidentally, it's one that will also require substantial development of supply chains outside of Europe and outside of European regulation as well as we stand.
So we have tons of questions coming in from the audience, which is great. Again, you can ask them in the Q&A portion. I have one more question I want to put to the panel before I start reading out the questions from you all out there in cyberspace. And it's about hydrogen, which is a little off topic, but I mentioned that there are lots of tools being considered for decarbonizing transport, and hydrogen in transport is one thing that people are talking about. Now, I talk to a lot of people who say this is a crazy pipe dream. You could never have a car powered by hydrogen. And then other people say, well, hold on, maybe it's possible, or at least maybe for other types of transport. Maybe who would like to take that? I mean, do you think that hydrogen in road transport is a viable possibility for the future? Anybody want to take that? Yep, Paul.
I'll jump in, Dave. Absolutely. And many of our manufacturers are looking very actively at the possibility of hydrogen combustion in engines, as well as the use of hydrogen in fuel cells, of course, to drive vehicles by electric power. Work is ongoing. I know Alex's colleagues are working on some of the approval requirements for hydrogen combustion, particularly in trucks. And for the heavy duty sector, yes, that is an alternative which is real and does exist. The issue of infrastructure needs to be addressed as well, and I'm pretty sure that will take off, particularly in the heavy duty sector. But the infrastructure will need to keep pace, because presently there's very few hydrogen refueling stations in Europe. If it's going to be a fuel of the future, the infrastructure needs to be developed to be capable of delivering hydrogen for both passenger cars of sufficient high quality for fuel cell use, but perhaps at a lesser quality if the hydrogen is going to be burnt in engines. But also reflecting that for heavy duty vehicles, the hydrogen needs to be pumped at much higher pressure and potentially also in liquid form. But yes, it does exist, and it is a real potential new fuel for the road transport sector.
John, what do you think? Well, I'll build on what Paul has said. It can play a significant role. My industry has deep experience. In fact, refineries produce a lot of hydrogen for their own use at the moment, and so very familiar with the engineering of that. Hydrogen is quite a challenging fuel to work with. In order to get energy density, you need extreme pressure. Vehicles that run hydrogen typically run at about 700 bar or 800 bar storage, which is extremely high pressure. When you consider existing gaseous fuel vehicles on the road, like autogas or LPG vehicles, run at about 4 bar. Running at 800 bar on the vehicle is very high technology, needs a lot of risk management, and I think I'm not alone in having viewed that it's not very suitable as a retail technology. For heavy duty trucks and for stationary applications in industry and perhaps railways as well, where there can be a really good maintenance regime and safety regime, then it can play a really important role. Likewise, also in shipping, possibly either as hydrogen gas or as ammonia as well, many looking at that. I think the big question mark is whether it works for passenger cars. As an industry, we've sold gaseous fuels next to petrol and diesel for some decades. You look in Belgium, I don't know whether you noticed the prices, but in Belgium, you'll pay around €1.30 for petrol or diesel, and you'll pay about 50 cents for autogas. The market share of autogas, 3 or 4%. Customers actually don't like a gaseous fuel if they have a choice. That's just the market data that we've had over the years. So it brings me back to the point, definitely a role, significantly, most likely in commercial transport, question marks over whether it works so well in retail. Having said that, the prototypes have been there. I've driven some of them. They're very nice, superb products from several of the companies. But whether they will work, whether customers will be happy with them, is a bigger question.
Yeah, those are some interesting points. I actually just rented a methane car in Italy over the summer and was really, really cheap, very difficult to refill. Alex, let's go to you. What's your thought on whether hydrogen is viable, and maybe even the larger question about just gaseous fuels, whether consumers are willing to use them?
Yeah, no, I think building on what Paul and John were saying, I think clearly hydrogen is part of the toolbox of technologies available, which will grow in the future in terms of helping to decarbonize the transport sector. From our analysis, we see it also mainly in the heavy-duty sector, but also in the passenger cars. This could be an option, and we know that some manufacturers are looking carefully at that for some also particular type of applications. So yes, definitely this is a very important technology, and the Commission in its recent hydrogen strategy has shown how important hydrogen will be in the pathway towards decarbonization, and will play an important role also in the transport sector. So this is part indeed of this toolbox of technologies.
Well, let's open it up to the viewers out there. By the way, if you go into the Q&A section, if you see a question that's already been asked that you also would like the answer to, you can give it a thumbs up. That puts it at the top of my screen and knows lots of people want to know the answer. So we've had several questions so far on this internal combustion engine question about whether the Commission is seeking to ban the internal combustion engine, at least in city centers. I remember this was an idea floated by the Commission in city centers, at least all the way back to the white paper in 2011. So I'm gonna, again, we've had several questions on this. I'm gonna take the top rated one, which is from Robert Tiemann Leon, it's cut off there. So he asks, the climate target plan announces an ICE ban. Is the EC not giving the wrong signal towards investors in advanced fuels? And I think that sums up the other questions as well. Is talk of an ICE ban going to hurt the growth of biofuels? Alex, that's a question for you.
Yeah, so I mean, on that question, I cannot add much to what the Commission said in its climate target plan. So maybe just recall what he said in that communication is that in the work we have been doing in the climate target plan and looking again at the 2050 perspective, so this long-term climate neutrality objective that we have, we see in our impact assessment that to reach that climate neutral objective by 2050, we will need that nearly all the cars on the roads around 2050 will be zero emission vehicles. So this means that there will be a certain point in time where internal combustion engine will stop coming in the market. And the objective that we have now is to look into that in our upcoming impact assessment and to dig more specifically on this topic. And whether this is closing the door for other type of fuels, I would say this is not the case, because again, we need to look at the transport sector in an holistic way. And we need to look not only at road transport, but also at different modes of transport, and also looking at how we can decarbonize also the emissions of the current fleet. And there, this is not only the new vehicles, which will need to be addressed, but also in terms of the fuels which are currently marketed. And in the analysis that we have been doing, we see that there will be an increase, as I said, in terms of advanced biofuel being available to Europe, as well as more generally synthetic fuels. But one has to look also at the availability of this fuel and where does it make sense, most sense, to use this fuel. And what the Commission has been saying is that it makes sense to direct this fuel into the sectors which are the most difficult to decarbonize, in particular aviation and maritime. And there will be some also further policy development in that field, which will be looking at how to stimulate the uptake of low carbon fuel in these sectors. One again has to look at the broader picture, and the production of synthetic fuels we know has some issues regarding the efficiency of the production of this fuel, how much energy does it require to produce these fuels. It also raises issues regarding the availability of the feedstock. And yeah, again, one has to look at the overall pathways to decarbonize the economy, and not only looking at road transport.
Dasha, let me put this question to you. I mean, as a producer of biofuel, how do you feel when you hear this talk of banning ICEs? Dasha, a question for you.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you properly. Sorry, I lost you for a moment.
When you hear these suggestions about banning internal combustion engines in city centers, et cetera, what's your response as a producer of biofuel that would be using ICEs?
Well, there is still a long way in front of us, and all the analyses which are available now show that even if the electromobility is rising, the role of internal combustion engines will be still very important also in the future. So I think that conventional cars will be on the road still beyond 2030, and that's why the role of biofuels is so crucial. Let's see what the future will bring us. For sure, we don't think that it is a great idea to put a concrete date of phasing out internal combustion engines, because this is something which doesn't match with technology neutrality, and the uptake of all electromobility is still quite low. For example, Slovakia is, together with Greece and Poland, the last 3 countries where there were like 300 electric vehicles sold last year. So we think that really there should be focus on technology neutrality, and let's see how it all develops. But for the future, I don't know, 10, 20 years, we think that there will be still a crucial role for biofuels.
Okay, our next question comes from Jean-Benoit Schranz. He asks, and this is another rated question, so he says, decarbonization of cars, wouldn't it be normal to adopt a well-to-wheel approach to ensure a level playing field? So let's put that question to Paul. Let me put that question to you. I mean, what's ASEA's position on having a well-to-wheel approach instead of tailpipe?
What is a well-to-wheel approach? The traditional view is that 25% of the greenhouse gas emissions comes from producing and delivering the fuel, with the rest coming from the combustion and use of the fuel. So we're very concerned about expressing it as a well-to-wheel figure, because we will be fearful that more of the pressure comes on our shoulders. So, but we do accept that both parts need to be joined up sometimes. Tank to wheel is what we have today. Well to tank is what the fuel suppliers have already in Article 7A of the FQD. We think there needs to be some further improvements on that, and what John's association is advocating through the Vision 2050 is going to be a great contribution to the wells to tank side. But indeed, we think there are ways in which you could try and find the links between well to tank and the tank to wheel parts, and that was already mentioned, I think, at least in the heavy duty CO2 regulation. And we have a high level of interest in finding ways to link those two parts. As John had said earlier, if a vehicle on the road has access to a lower carbon fuel compared to the one on which it was certified and the CO2 results for that vehicle were generated when it was new, then there should be some advantage to the vehicle. So in our opinion, targets for the both sides, but trying to find a link to join those two separate responsibilities together in a sensible and holistic way.
So I think some skepticism about the approach there. John, what's your take on a well-to-wheel approach?
Well, I think Alex made an important point earlier with some concern about if you're having a combined effect, do you end up with some kind of mixing of responsibilities? I think it's really important to clarify that, because clearly you cannot have car makers being dependent on fuel suppliers delivering a portion of the savings that they are regulated to achieve. It needs better clarification than that. And so we do need to find ways to have, how can I put it, differentiated responsibilities, but additive effects at the customer level and obviously the climate ambition level. And we do believe that's possible, and we'll continue to explore those ideas. But let me just develop another idea a little bit. And the observation that we make is that, if you like, the mental model of how to decarbonize transport, and certainly road transport, has basically become, how do we get more zero emission vehicles on the road? It's become defined as fleet turnover at the new vehicle level. Now, that isn't the only way to think about it, but that is the political reality of how it's being regarded by many in Europe now. And okay, we recognize that, but we would still challenge and say, what's the objective here? The objective is actually to have reduced CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. And so if you were to redefine that and say new vehicles with fossil carbon emissions, then that gives you clarity over the purpose, and it sort of keeps you to that principle of how we turn over the fleet. It then leaves you with the idea of, how do you tie a volume of very low carbon or climate neutral fuel to that vehicle? Well, we've got precedents for that already. In the electricity world, there are many contracts available to large companies where you can dedicate renewable electricity supply to that company so that it can be assured it only gets renewables. It's actually going through the same wires. It's just done with a very robust accounting system. We think we could do that. We actually have lots of the administration infrastructure already. And we think that could be a way of exploring how, whether it's the car maker or whether it's the customer, could be a fleet operator, rental car company or something, could commit for the life of the vehicle to have very low carbon fuel supplied for that vehicle, and then get the benefits of what is currently flowing to a hydrogen or an electric vehicle. That would get a lot of new fuel supply built. That would get a lot of big projects financed. And we think that's an interesting opportunity.
Alex, I mean, I think this question is probably mostly directed to you. What does the Commission think about this approach of measurement?
Yeah, I would like to turn back to John, because he is the promoter of some new concept and ideas. So it would be good if maybe you tell us a bit more about how you see this, how you say, differentiated responsibilities, and how would you account for that more precisely? I think that would be quite interesting to hear, because during the previous co-decision process, that was one of the very important elements. Also, how to express the obligations on fuel suppliers. Would we then have to express that obligation in terms of greenhouse gas emissions? How would we account this obligation on the fuel suppliers towards the manufacturers of vehicles, which would benefit from some credits, I understand. So in that case, would manufacturers have less stringent targets, or would they have to account for stricter targets? I think that would be interesting, because this concept of well-to-wheel, I mean, we talk a lot about it. This is a concept which is in the mind of many. And as I said, this is something that the Commission is really keen to look at on this issue of an holistic approach. But it doesn't mean that it has to be covered in one piece of legislation, or that we have to create complex linkages between legislation. So yeah, happy to hear a bit more about the ideas from Europe on that.
John, do you want to elaborate a bit now?
Well, yes. I mean, the first thing I'd say is, I mean, it would be good if we could agree with what success looks like here, because sometimes it feels like a little bit we're having to push to get the idea on the table. So as it just seems obvious that some of the vehicle fleet in the long term could be supplied with a completely renewable fuel, and that would be an attractive mix. We've done the work. We did the work with Ricardo 2 years ago, showing exactly what that looks like. Sometimes it feels as if we keep having to push to try and get it as a consideration, and the default is always going back to, yeah, well, we've kind of decided the whole fleet is going to go electric. And I actually haven't seen the work that shows the battery supply chain is there to do a 20-fold increase of batteries. What that means for the imports into Europe for that, the indirect effects of that. Every scale up that we do in Europe is going to have indirect effects and effects on trade. And we're not advocating against electrification. We're trying to say there's a complementary approach as well. You need both at scale. If we can agree what success looks like, we think it'll be easier to work together on what's the regulatory structure that gets our members to sign the billion-dollar commitments to build those plants over and over again. And yes, we need a little creativity, but the building blocks seem to be mostly there. So we're committed to work on it with you, for sure.
We have a next question from Christina Mestre from Transport and Environment. Well, nope, that's not the right one. Yeah, here. It's about indirect effects again. So what about indirect effects for advanced biofuels? These are not assessed or tackled. Alex, I think that's a question for you. Would you agree with this characterization that the second generation biofuels are not having ILUC effects tackled under the new framework?
What I would say is that in the current framework, in the RED II, there are sustainability criteria which have been laid down and which apply to advanced biofuel as other fuels. Now, whether this needs to be looked at again, I mean, yeah, we're happy to get views from Transport and Environment on this point.
Dasha, let me put the same question to you. Would you say that second generation biofuels are not having ILUC effects accounted for?
I don't see any reason why it should be reopened again. As I mentioned, the ILUC debate has been here for several years and has been tackled in the Delegated Act, where the result was that the palm oil should be phased out. And for advanced biofuels, which are produced from waste and residues, I really do not see any point to look at ILUC effect, which was already considered in the production of the original product from which the waste and residues come from. And I would like to mention that really we need to have this holistic approach and fair view on all the technologies which are in place now. That's why I liked what John said in the reply on his on previous question. and I also agree that there must be a way where we find the real and justice picture, which has to be shown to the customer and to the public, like about the reality of emissions. I know that there might be some injustices or justices between fuel suppliers, car manufacturers, but as the public, we need really to have a clear pictures and a whole picture about the technology.
We have a related question, Dasha, and I've lost it here, but it was a question basically, would it be helpful for you if there was some kind of regulatory framework in place to incentivize lower GHG second generation biofuels? Is that something that would be helpful or needed, you think?
What we as investors really need is stable legislation, the legislative regulatory framework which is predictable and which is really stable. Like I said, the example of our company, which has in pipeline the project for production of second generation lignocellulosic ethanol. And frankly speaking, we were about to start with this project already 1 or 2 years ago. This project is still ready, but didn't start yet because we don't feel this legislative stability and predictability. Like the targets which were adopted in the RED 2 for advanced biofuels were lower than in the Commission's proposal. And now we see that there are some other regulatory changes in front of us, new ideas coming, like the inclusion of the road transport sector into the ETS, which brings really a lot of uncertainty for investors, because we do not know how it will look like, and now we have to wait another few months until the June 2021 where we'll learn more details about it. So this is really for something what doesn't help investors to put tens or hundreds of million euros into the new technologies.
Okay, we have a question here from Jenny Palmblad. For the whole panel, so she says HVO, hydrotreated vegetable oil, is on the market and it decarbonizes diesel transport by 80%. Why not invest in that immediately? Anybody in the panel want to give their thoughts on HVO?
Yeah, I guess I can say something there. Well, first of all, we do have to respect the work that's been done on the limits of the availability of first-gen bio, in particular some concerns around vegetable oil. And the Commission's work there does set limits. And so the feedstock for HVO clearly has to be within the sustainability regulations that the European Commission has set. But HVO is also broadly a technology that can process a lot of different wastes, waste oils, waste fats, and agricultural wastes if they're appearing in an oily manner. And so the short answer is, where that can be scaled up with access to sustainable feedstocks, actually, yes. And that is something that we envisage. And that's part of the strategy and pathway that we've set out. That's one of the first steps. It takes you, a little bit along the way, but you've still got quite a bit further to go with other cellulosic, forestry wastes, agricultural wastes that are not oily in nature and require greater conversion processes.
Okay, we have a next question from Zoltan Zalo. It's a question for Paul. Will ASEA support E20, E30 standardization as modern engines need higher octane fuels?
We are highly interested in the potential of high octane gasoline to give a signal to manufacturers to design engines to take advantage of the guaranteed high octane and therefore improve the efficiency of the gasoline internal combustion engine. If the fuel can deliver octane, that's great. And we're advocating a minimum of 102, potentially even as a European main grade within the middle part of this next decade, and that's been part of our messaging on the FQD. There are couple of ways, or many ways, to achieve the octane, of course. Firstly, we don't want octane to be achieved by cheap octane boosters like nitrogen compounds, which we see coming in some markets, which are not accepted from our point of view because they simply damage engines. The other way you could do it is through the main refinery streams, and therefore deliver a high octane gasoline, which is effectively drop-in for use in complete fleet, which is obviously an encouragement to the fuel suppliers. And then the other way is to increase the ethanol content up to E20, E25. But then we would face the issue that such a high octane gasoline, primarily based with high ethanol content, would unfortunately be limited to vehicles that come in the future, vehicles which have been engineered specifically to deal with the exposure to higher ethanol rates. So in general, high octane is interesting, but there is still some discussion to be had on the best way forward to deliver that into the marketplace.
Alex, Zoltan has the same question for you. Will the EC take steps to standardize E20, E30 with octane increased?
Doing the fuel specification of the Fuel Quality Directive, which set a maximum of 10% ethanol, so E10 being the upper limit. So we are carrying out at the moment a technical study on that point, and stakeholders are of course invited to provide input to that. And depending the outcome of this technical analysis, we might have to, if it makes sense, look at this issue again to increase the current blending wall.
I have another question for Dasha here. So the questioner says, waste and residues are unevenly defined in member state laws. Is this uneven definition distorting or fragmenting the EU fuel markets?
I don't think so, and we all know that currently there is a project running with European Commission for adjustment of Annex 9, which defines advanced and waste-based feedstock for production of advanced and waste-based biofuels, and we've been involved in this project, and in my opinion, all the specific feedstocks, like more precise definitions of what's already in the Annex 9, were now involved into the definition of into the new definition in Annex 9. So my opinion is that everything what is already used in member states will be included in Annex 9. Otherwise, my experience also from the interaction with our government says that they are very careful by the definitions and by adding some or specifying more precisely the feedstocks, knowing that there is somewhere European Commission watching over it. So we do not really feel that, but it's true that advanced biofuels market is at a really very early stage of development, so this might come in the future. But for I think that it's well monitored.
We have two similar questions here that I'll take at the same time. So someone asks, what role, if any, do you see for carbon pricing? And then we have a question here from Jean Bollet. When do you think the carbon taxation will be in place? Anybody want to take that on the panel? John?
We've said a few things about carbon pricing. And I mentioned earlier, I mean, the carbon price signals in the regulations that we've got around transport at the moment are very high, and they're effective for the things that they're designed to regulate, I guess. The German regulation that is the implementation of the RED has got a published carbon price in there of 470 euros a ton of carbon. and it's one of the highest in any regulation. CO2 in cars, actually, the penalties on car makers if they don't meet those standards, 475 to 500 euros a ton, depending on how you do the maths. Fuel taxation today is, if you describe it as a carbon tax, the tax on a litre of petrol or diesel works out at around 210 euros a ton of carbon. So even though the regulation isn't called the Transport Carbon Pricing Bill or Directive, it is in effect a form of carbon pricing. Of course, in the case of fuel tax, it also taxes biofuels the same as petroleum. And we've been clear in calling for that to be changed to actually turn it into a carbon-based taxation. And if that is to happen, it will give significant support for investment in renewables. It's a little bit absurd that you can put electricity into a car that has come straight out of the coal-fired power station. There's no tax on that electricity. You can put the best advanced biofuel or synthetic fuel into a car, and it's taxed exactly the same as petroleum, as if the carbon is linear or fossil, if you like. We've actually had very warm response to that idea from a wide range of stakeholders across Commission, MEPs, etc. So carbon pricing is here, but we need to make it work better for transport to get everything done.
Alex, same question for you.
Yeah, so in its climate target plan of last week, the Commission has explained that it sees benefits in extending the EU ETS to fossil fuel because this provides a carbon price signal. It gives incentive to reduce emissions also for the fleet. It guarantees environmental integrity, and it allows also raising revenues, which can be reinvested in the economy to ensure a socially and just transition. So this will be something that the Commission will look at as part of the impact assessment on the EU ETS that it will carry out in view of the upcoming revision of that legislation. But also the Commission make it very clear in its climate target plan that in all cases, any possible extension of the EU ETS will be a complementary tool to the CO2 standards for cars and vans and heavy-duty vehicles, as I think we've been discussing it now for nearly an hour, that these CO2 standards are the key drivers for reducing emissions in the road transport field.
Well, I mean, I think as we can see, there's a lot of different tools in the toolbox here. I want to get some concluding thoughts from each of you, particularly drawing on what we've discussed here today, maybe new things that we've learned. Let's start with Desha. Let's start with you. What do you think should be the main thrust when we're looking at how biofuels can contribute to the Green Deal, based on what we've been talking about here today?
From all what was said here today, for me, the main takeover and the main idea is that really all the stakeholders are aware of the need of level playing field for everybody. For all the technologies, there is no silver bullet on the table which can decarbonize the transport sector and which can contribute to fulfillment of Green Deal goals. So I would really like to stress that together with development of all the new technologies, we need to take maximum advantage of what is already on the table now. What has been proved during the time by strict sustainability criteria, and what can really contribute to decarbonization of transport sector and fulfillment of the Green Deal goals. And these are sustainable biofuels, both conventional and advanced, and all the other ideas which were also developed here really, I thank you, everybody, for raising up the issues of well-to-wheel emissions and life cycle emissions, and looking for the way how to measure it and how to show to the public the real picture. Thank you.
Paul, let's go to you next. What's your main takeaway from today's discussion?
Clearly, there's lots of different pieces of policy and legislation that need to be joined up to make progress towards the aims of the Green Deal. And in respect of the 2030 climate plan, I think everybody knows from the communications that we've issued recently that we're very supportive of the aims of these policies, subject to the details, of course. Clearly, that there is a role here now for the Renewable Energy Use Directive to be a driving instrument to help reduce CO2 from fuels. We would certainly expect the targets for 2030 to be increased to eliminate double counting, which just simply dilutes the impact of that regulation, and to set targets, ambitious targets for general renewable energy use in transport targets, but also for the more advanced synthetic type of fuels, which can be far more progressive than they are. And those targets, together with the vision coming from the Vision 2050 program of Fuels Europe, I think will start to push things along. But that's not on its own alone. We need to have a bit more linkage between the role of the RED in terms of CO2 reduction potential of fuels and the Fuel Quality Directive in terms of defining fuels as well, particularly quality fuels. People seem to forget that the customer must have things which are of a sufficiently high quality for putting in their vehicles, and that's sometimes lost in the overall mix. And there needs to be some attention to the pricing mechanisms as well. As John has said, the price of carbon is not conducive, particularly with regards to the figures he's quoted from the conversion of the 95 grams penalties to something on a carbon basis for transport, and what's paid in other sectors as well. And indeed, in the review of the Energy Taxation Directive, it does warrant a serious consideration how to use that as a tool for giving some also taxation-based incentives for low carbon fuels, without necessarily putting a negative picture on traditional fossil fuels. So I think that's it for the moment, David. Lots of work to do, though.
Indeed. John, what are your main takeaways from today? John, I think you need to turn on your mic.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, now it's on.
Good. Okay. One of the things I said earlier, let's imagine what success looks like and work back from that. And I'm going to say that we should imagine what success looks like not only for Europe, but also the contribution Europe makes to helping the world get to decarbonisation, because actually we need the whole world to have strong climate action to succeed in balancing the climate. And we believe that Europe should play a key role in developing a wide range of technologies, and to do that as soon as possible, and to bring down the cost, to scale them up and bring down the cost as well of those technologies. It's clear to us that Europe will play a leading role, but that simply also means that other countries will be behind. We know that there will be internal combustion engines in other parts of the world for decades to come. Europe has got a lead there in making very clean, very efficient hybridized vehicles. It would be very useful for Europe to continue to improve those worldwide. There are also technologies around use of biomass. While Europe is not that wealthy in biomass, other regions of the world have huge quantities of biomass, and technologies to convert those into useful fuels and products are really important technologies for the future. Europe can get a lot done with its strong policies. We welcome the Green Deal, we welcome the increased ambition for 2030, but we do think there's some great opportunities to get a range of technologies developed. So we're going to continue to be constructive to try and find a way to make all of those good things work. And we would like to avoid having a technology monopoly that prevents the biomass, the liquids technologies come forward faster. Thanks.
And finally, Alex, you guys will be crafting all these regulations going forward. What are your main takeaways from today's discussion?
But we will not do that alone. Huh? So I think I would like to thank you all for the very lively and useful discussion and input, because I think what I take from that discussion is, first, a mix of technologies, second, a mix of policy instruments, and the challenge is to make sure that we do that in a very consistent way and in a cost-effective way. So it will be indeed a lot of work ahead of us. There will be lots of instruments which will be open for review, several impact assessments being prepared, but we really count on the input from stakeholders to make sure that at the end, in June 2021, we have a very consistent policy mix to propose. And just a final word to also welcome the support that I hear around the table for the increased ambition level that the Commission proposed last week. So I also take with me the call for legal certainty and to have clear legislation agreed as soon as possible, so that the roadmap is very clear for all of us, and for, most importantly, investors, because at the end of the day, this transition will only happen if there are investments taking place. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, let's see if that enthusiasm for the raised target is matched by national governments in the coming weeks and months. Thank you all so much to our panelists for a great discussion, and thank you for at home for following along and asking some great questions. You can find more Euractiv debates going forward over the coming weeks and months as well. So thank you for following along, and I wish you all a great evening. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.